Thank you for inviting me. I would like to first talk about perceptions, community perceptions versus personal realities, as well as the traumas I've endured. Let me first start with three relevant definitions. I am a transgender woman. So, what is that? A transgender person is someone who grows up knowing that their body doesn't match who they know who they are inside. So they transition and live as the gender they have always known themselves to be. There's an old cliche term, born in the wrong body. I'm not sure if anybody's ever heard that. The other definition would be transphobia, and that's very important. It's a range of negative attitudes, feelings, or actions toward transgender people. These feelings can manifest itself in harassment, bullying, taunts, threats of violence, workplace, housing discrimination, violence, and death. The last definition I like to give you, that we'll talk about later when I start talking about my own experience, is trauma bonding. So, what is trauma bonding? It's an emotional attachment that forms when an individual is stuck in a repeated cycle of abuse. Though it can seem counterintuitive to many people, abuse can result in intense feelings or a trauma bond between the person being abused and the abuser. So those are some definitions I will let marinate with you as I move forward. So, one of the joys of my life is running. After I experienced the trauma that I'll discuss later, I stopped running. I've been running all my life, ever since 8th grade when I ran track and cross country in high school, and I've run all my life. But after the trauma I experienced, I faced post-traumatic stress disorder and had a few very difficult years that required therapy and intervention and so much time to heal. During this period, I was inactive or inconsistent. I really didn't want to do anything. And I gained a lot of weight, and I didn't feel like myself. On December 27th, 2019, I looked at a scale, and I weighed 198 pounds, going towards 200. And to put that in perspective, before the trauma happened, I was a size 4. So the men out there might not know what this means, the ladies do. I started running again on December 27, 2019, after I weighed myself. That was 3.5 years ago. And it was merely to lose weight. And for some reason, unlike the previous 7 years, I took to it. And I've run every single day since. And as of today, that's 1,327 days running every single day. So why is this important to me? Why is this even relevant to talk about running? Well, because a young woman whom I admired greatly was a runner. I never met her, but she was an awesome runner. She ran multiple Boston marathons. And coincidentally, she also ran early in the morning. And of course, Virginia is considered down south in the summertime. You can't always run at midday. But she was incredible. She's not from Virginia, I'm talking about myself. But she was an incredible young woman, a loving wife and mother, and an elementary school teacher teaching the 2nd grade. It's hard to talk about. And this is a person I don't know. I never met. One morning at 4 a.m., she was doing her regular 8-mile-plus run when she was brutally attacked. The attacker attempted to rape her, but she fought back with all of her might. A terrible struggle ensued, and the human monster shot this beautiful young teacher in the head and tried to dispose of her body. Her name is Eliza Fletcher. I don't know if this comes up clear. She's my guardian angel. She's the most courageous woman who I've ever heard of, and every day I think about her, not only while I'm running, early in the morning, it's dark, but before I start running. She is my motivation. But what compounds this tragedy, and this is why I talk about perceptions, is that the man who killed her raped another woman a year earlier, a woman named Alicia Franklin. She reported the rape to the local police. She cooperated. They had his DNA. They had everything they needed to make an arrest. This man was also a felon. He spent 19 years in prison for kidnapping. But the police in this jurisdiction slow-walked the case. And if they would have arrested him for the rape of Alicia Franklin, Eliza Fletcher would still be alive. I mentioned perceptions. The perceptions are, and this is regardless of the jurisdiction, that black women are treated less than. Alicia Franklin was black. And they're treated less than by the police, and their complaints are not aggressively pursued as a white woman's complaint would be. And a troubling statistic is that 35% of black women experience sexual violence during their lifetime. Perceptions of deep mistrust between the police and people of color. And you might have heard this, and I've heard it over and over again, that black mothers have to have the talk with their children, especially their sons, as to what to do if they are stopped by the police. The fear is if they do the wrong thing, they could be killed by the police. I've never heard a white parent saying they have to give their children the talk. With regard to the transgender community, we feel that we are under attack by a large population in this country, especially a population, and I don't want to get political, but it's out there, made by conservatives. A trans woman named Dylan Mulvaney, she's a celebrity in her own right, has something like millions of TikTok followers. She was asked what many celebrities are asked to do: support a product. See it all the time. That product being Bud Light. And for just simply being asked to support this product, a famous far-right entertainer took out a weapon and shot cans of Bud Light and encouraged a boycott of the product, and many conservatives joined in, including conservative presidential candidates. And as a result, the company lost millions of dollars, and it caused them to lay off hundreds of people, Americans, out of work because of this, simply because of transphobia and a hatred of transgender people. The perception is that most members of law enforcement community is usually conservative, and will they let their feelings towards certain populations affect their response on their jobs in helping those communities, such as the transgender community. For a variety of reasons, many transgender people are hesitant to contact or cooperate with law enforcement, even when they are in need of help or assistance. According to a survey, 2/3 of transgender people who interacted with the police in the last year were mistreated in some way. And I'm just talking about this here in Virginia, nationally. We're mistreated in some way. And this mistreatment ranged from verbal or physical to the mistreatment was either verbal or physical, all the way up to sexual harassment. 1 in 10 said they were profiled as sex workers, and 1 in 20 were physically assaulted by the police. As a transgender woman myself, I can say the feeling is that, and I feel this way, that many conservatives wish to wipe us off the face of the earth. And as I mentioned before, the perception is that most police officers are conservative. What I spoke of are general perceptions. That's not inclusive of everybody, but these are perceptions, and we know what perceptions are. So let's talk about reality. Let's get away from perceptions. Let me speak about the reality of me dealing with the police, being a trans woman. And I'll talk a little bit about my transition. I knew from a very young age that I was not a boy, not inside. I knew this from at least 7 years of age, and I faced bullying by bigger kids, and I tried my best to be what everyone wanted me to be, a boy. But in 8th grade, knowing that I was not a boy, and as I stated, I had known this for many years by then, I decided to do something about it. This was a year that I first tried to come out. Now, coming out wasn't a phrase back when I was, not to give away my age all that much, but when I was not a phrase back when I was young. Transgender wasn't even a word back then. There was no internet, there's no social media, no YouTube, there's no information at all. And I didn't think there was anyone else in the world like me. My friends and other kids were not like me that I knew. And I was not trying to make a statement, but one day, with my mother at work, I put on some of her clothes, this pretty blouse that tied at the bottom. I put on some jewelry like a necklace. I looked in the mirror and I thought for the first time that I was pretty. It felt so good to finally be me. I smiled and I wanted to share this happiness. I went to the playground and this bigger kid who I thought was my friend called me a faggot, and I have to use that word. It was the first time that word was ever applied to me. It was a bad word. I was later assaulted by another kid for looking as I was looking. I didn't understand the hate and the ridicule. The 70s were just not ready for a child like me, so I went back in the closet. I wanted the other kids not to ridicule me. I wanted to be accepted. I would do anything to gain this acceptance, even negative behavior. In 8th grade, I smoked a cigarette for the first time. And the boy who gave it to me told me that I was cool. And I said, imagine that, someone thinking that I was cool? If kids dared me to do something, I would do it. And sometimes it was dangerous, like climbing on the undercarriage of a bridge. But the next thing I want to talk about caused me to meet with law enforcement. And this meeting shaped my own personal perceptions of the police. Up to that point, I never interacted with the police. I lived in a middle-class environment. I rarely saw a cop in our neighborhood. So I generally had positive feelings about the police and law enforcement. Then one day, while walking home from track practice, I was in the 8th grade, so I was 12 or 13, a boy dared me to shoplift a 6-pack of beer. Now, as 12 and 13-year-olds, we didn't drink beer. We weren't going to drink it either, but that wasn't the point. It was a dare. So I ran in the store with all 95 pounds of me. I grabbed a 6-pack and ran out, placing it in my gym bag. And we laughed as we ran. We did this amazing thing. But the weight of this stupidity hit me less than a block away. And all of a sudden, a sense of extreme fear came over me. What did I do? We split up and ran, but less than 2 blocks away, a police car pulled up. I was terrified. But this officer wasn't angry. He just told me to get in the car. He didn't put handcuffs on me. He didn't search me. As he drove, he talked to me. And he told me in a stern but compassionate voice to never do such a thing again. I listened. I still have some fear because I knew when I got back home, this is in that era, that a spanking was waiting for me and being yelled at by mom and dad, so I knew that was waiting. But he drove around the corner, and there was my friend, an accomplice, and he was a white kid, and he was handcuffed around a telephone pole. I was shocked to see that. I didn't understand it, like why they put him in the car when he looked for me. But if you can imagine the visual, if you can even imagine this visual today, the black kid, me being talked to by a fatherly white police officer, and the white kid handcuffed around a pole. He got out of the car, took off the cuffs, and told my friend to go home. But he was going to drive me home since I was the one who shoplifted. I sat quietly, gave him back the beer, and waited to meet my parents and the punishment I had coming, and I knew I had it coming. He continued to talk to me, and all I felt from him was care. He took me home. He opened the car door. I said, "Yes, sir." But he didn't meet my parents. He didn't even go to the door. I walked to the house. I was relieved. No spanking today. But this positive actions made me think about my negative actions. Or his positive actions, his actions are positive, made me focus on my negative actions. So I wasn't thinking about his negative actions because there weren't any. That day, I respected police officers even more than I did before. And it struck me, the police were there to help kids. It had such a profound experience on me that never again did I ever shoplift. And 7 years later, when I enlisted in the Army, I chose the Military Police Corps. I wanted to be like that officer. The police seemed like the most amazing people. My perceptions as a child then and into my adult life was 180 degrees different from the perceptions I had mentioned earlier. Before I transitioned, when I presented as a black man, I was never profiled or treated poorly by the police. Into my adult life, the positive feelings I had about law enforcement remain. Like in all professions, there's good and bad, but I just thought, based on my own personal experience, that there was more, much more good than bad. My experience as a transgender woman was different than my experience as a black man. As a person of color who presented as a black male most of my life, I saw what racism was and recognized it, and it's something every black male or female in this country we can recognize when we feel racism. But as a transgender woman of color, this was something different. I lost friendships. I was asked to leave my home. I became unemployed, almost unemployable. And for the first time in my life, as resources diminished over a period of time, I became homeless. And I faced the same ridicule at this advanced age that I did when I was that young. The gay slurs returned. As the money ran out, as a vulnerable homeless woman, sleeping in truck stops, sometimes in office buildings, sometimes in my car, bathing in public restrooms, and occasionally staying in flea-bag hotels that I can describe generously as squalor, I started going out with a man who said that he loved me. It was an abusive relationship, and he threatened me one night. I called the police. All my life, my thoughts were, if you need help, call the police. I had never called the police before in my old life. I had no reason to do so. But this man was threatening me, and I called 911. A single police officer arrived. This man who I'd been dating, he fled the scene, so he wasn't there. But the officer was initially very compassionate. I was in my early stage of transition, but he treated me as a woman. He asked for my ID. He saw that my name on the ID and my driver's license was different than the name I gave him because I had not legally changed my name yet or my gender marker. When he looked at it, saw male and a male name, there's a little snicker. There's a smile curled on his mouth, like he was figuring the things out. It wasn't a woman in distress. It was two gay guys fighting, and wasn't that funny? Now, of course, I couldn't read his mind, only observed his body language. But as soon as my ID confirmed my male status, his helpful, kind behavior changed to one of indifference. He was no longer helpful, stating that there was nothing he could do, and he just left. I was living in a flea-bag motel, had very few friends, no resources, no job. That boyfriend called the next day apologizing over and over again. This was trauma bonding 101. I didn't want to be alone. He brought gifts, said he would be nice to me. He told me that he would get help, so I allowed him back into my life. But his jealousy remained, and about a month later, he started making comments like, if he ever saw me with another man, he would kill him. He told me that I could never leave him. I tried assuring him that I would never cheat on him. I was very afraid. Then one day, he was going to take me to dinner and to the movies. I told him fine, it was Friday. But I told him, almost trying to get permission, that on Saturday I was going to be hanging out with some new friends that I met. And they were friends in the gay community. He asked what friends, but I didn't want to tell him because I didn't want him, because I knew how jealous he was, and I just didn't want him around my new friends, scaring everybody away. He got really quiet on the ride to Ruby Tuesday, and I tried to cheer him up, tried to be funny. We had dinner, but he didn't say a word throughout dinner. Then as we left to go to the movies, he asked me one last time, and he was angry. I want the name of the people you're seeing tomorrow, and I want it right now. I got upset with this badgering, and I no longer wanted to go to the movies, and I said, can you just take me to my car? We were like 15 miles away from his apartment where my car was parked. We took his car. He flexed both fists like this. He walked towards me. He said, I'm gonna fuck you up. Now, I was terrified. I'd been on female hormones for a while by then. I was no longer strong. I had no testosterone or very little left in my body. There's no way I could fight this man. It wouldn't even be a match. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I ran back into Ruby Tuesday, screaming and crying that this man was going to kill me. He chased me in. I was fast. I was a runner. So I was able to get away. I ran into Ruby Tuesday, past the restaurant part, all the way back to the kitchen part. And I screamed, he's going to kill me. The waiters and the other men in Ruby Tuesday did not let him go back there. And all the women in Ruby Tuesday got around me to try to protect me. And they comforted me, and they called the police. The police arrived, and I was so happy to see a female police officer, because I remember what happened the last time with the male police officer. I gave her a description. They found his car. He had left the area, and his car, they had stopped him, made a stop on him, and just held him there while they got more information. I told the police officer what happened. She was very compassionate. I have to use that word again. She told me that they would drive me to my car, because even if they didn't have grounds to press charges, because I didn't give him a chance to hit me, that they would drive me to my car that was parked at his apartment so he wouldn't get there and wait for me. But she did ask if I wanted to press charges. And I said, yes. She asked for my ID. By then, my name was changed to my female current name, but my gender marker wasn't not yet changed. That's a longer process in Virginia. When she saw that it had M for male, just like the other officer, I guess she figured out something in her brain. Her affect changed, and that understanding person became one, just like the other police officer, of indifference. She told the officer who was holding him that he could let him go. She told me that since he didn't actually hit me, there was nothing they could do. I asked and pleaded, will you still drive me to get my car? Because when I get there, he might be there. And she said, no, we can't do that. You need to get a cab. So I was scared. What if I got back, he had a head start, and he was waiting for me by my car when I got there? I don't know what I would do. I had no one to help me. The police won't help me. The new friends I was making, I didn't even want to get them involved. He told me he would kill other people involved with me. So I took and paid for a very expensive cab ride back to my car, and thank goodness I got to the apartment before he arrived. I jumped in the car and drove back to the nasty hotel, but stayed in a different room. Over the next few days, he called and called and called, but I didn't answer. He had messages apologizing. But I said, no, I'm free. I'm not getting back in this relationship. He sent gifts. One night in this cheap hotel, while I was sleeping, something bit me. It felt like something with sharp teeth. I didn't know what it was. Like, was it a rat? I mean, it's like, oh my God. I jumped out of bed, and I usually kept the lights off, but I turned on the lights. I didn't see anything at first. As I moved the pillow, there was the largest bed bug I'd ever seen in my life. It's part of sound funny, but it felt like it was like a mutant bed bug. This was the lowest point of my life. Of all I accomplished before then, before I transitioned to be living like this, the place I was living was hell. It was horrible. It was literally abuse to stay there. I stayed there about 5 weeks because it was cheap, but it was full of bed bugs and roaches, and every day I was itching, even during the day. The linen was dirty. I felt less than human. I slept each night with the light on, and I slept on top of the linen using my own linen. I felt under siege, but I also felt trapped, with the only other place to go being a homeless shelter. And unfortunately, I went to a homeless shelter one night and they turned me away. I had no money, no one to call. So in desperation, I called him. He told me that he was seeing a therapist, was taking medication. He apologized for how he treated me. He bought me this gift, a rock and roll Mickey Mouse. I asked if I could stay with him as a friend. I emphasized that we were no longer boyfriend, girlfriend, but if he let me stay a few nights just so I can get my head together, continue looking for jobs. He said, yes, stay as long as you like. I emphasized with him. I told him that there's no sex, this is not a sexual relationship. I was just there as a friend. And he agreed. And I moved in with him. I had nowhere else to go. He had no couches, only one bed, so we had to sleep on the same bed. But he kept his boundaries the first couple of nights. I made dinner for him a couple times when he got back from work. I kept looking for a job, but I didn't trust him. So I kept most of my belongings in the car in case I needed to make a escape. And fortunately, he didn't take my car keys from me, so I had my car keys. Then I started noticing that he was accumulating weapons. That made me really nervous. Then one night, he wanted to have sex. I told him no. I was petrified. I literally felt like something bad was going to happen to me. But he was on top of me. I told him no, please don't. But he ignored me and raped me. I tried to escape my body, as strange as that sounds, to like hover over what was happening to me. I didn't understand what he was doing to me. I just couldn't deal with it. I just had no control. I finished and laid there. I didn't sleep. I felt paralyzed. The next day he got up, he didn't say a word. It was like he knew what he did. He left and went to work, but my mind told me he didn't really go to work. He was outside the apartment surveilling it to see if I tried to leave. And then if I tried to leave, he might kill me. So I didn't leave. I couldn't leave. He came back from work, told me to cook him dinner. Next night, took me out for dinner. I felt like I was dying inside. I didn't want to literally die, but he didn't take my car keys, so I had to chance it. After the response of the police on those other occasions when I asked for help, I really gave no thought of calling the police. That didn't even enter my mind. I figured they would be on his side. He went to work, and I gained the courage to leave. So what I said I would do, I have the keys, all my belongings are in the car. I'm going to sprint to the car. I can outrun him if he's there. And I'm just gonna, I got to get out of here. So I did. I sprinted to the car. He wasn't there. That whole thing was my fear that he was waiting outside. I didn't know where to drive. I had no place to go. I couldn't go back to that hotel. I wouldn't go back to that hotel. There's this gay bar in the town where I was at, where I started to develop some friends. I drove the car into that parking lot behind the bar, and I had to drive behind because if he was looking for me on the main road, he'd see my car. And I just sat there like, I have nowhere to go. What am I going to do? I had no money, nowhere to go. But then I remembered a trans woman I had met several weeks earlier. And she was really nice to me. I hadn't met many trans people by then. She was the only one that I knew, just back in 2012. I didn't tell her what happened, just that I needed a place to stay. And I told her, quote unquote, I had to fight with my boyfriend and I had to leave. That's how I sort of told her. And she gave me a warning. Don't bring any SHIT over here. She told me I could stay for 5 weeks. I put the rape behind me. I blamed myself. I said he must not have understood. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding. And I tried to never think about it again, ever. And as far as I was concerned, it was over. That happened. I'm out of there. It's time for me to move on. But there was something in the mail. It hadn't reached me yet, but it was in the mail. It's called PTSD. It would soon arrive. Several weeks later, I finally found a job as a case manager of a family shelter. But by then, PTSD had arrived. During my first week, there was a crisis. One of the women I was working with was assaulted by her boyfriend. She called me up and asked me to come. She was my client. She said, I was her case manager. She asked me to come pick her up. And I started having a flashback when she asked me. And everyone in the office saw me as a confident person, but now everyone in the office saw that I was falling to pieces on this phone call. But my job as a case manager to take care of my client. So I got in the car and I drove slowly to go pick her up. And then I started shivering uncontrollably, and I thought, what if he's there? Not the person that did this to me, but her boyfriend. What if he takes us both hostage or something? Like, I was terrified. I've never been, like, I'm a former enlisted person, former military officer. I'd never been as scared in my life as I was at that point, driving there. I finally got there, but by the time I got there, all the other women in the about 4 or 5 people from the office had drove the same location, so I had all this support. But that's not what they're supposed to do. You know, I'm supposed to be able to do my job. I was able to drive her to the office, get her into a woman's shelter. She ended up doing well. But what he did to me months earlier, was now in control of my life. There were other incidents on the Washington Metro. If any woman's been on the Metro, you know the things that can happen there. The world was all too much. So one day at work, I attempted suicide by trying to run into traffic. On busy Richmond Highway. I was going to run right into traffic. The police were called, and I was taken to a mental health hospital, where a therapist sat with me and talked to me for hours, and he helped me understand myself and understand what I was going through. I had to take some time off from work, and I was admitted into a group for group therapy and individual therapy, and that therapy lasted for about a year. I had to quit that job because I needed time to heal. Finally, in 2015, 3 years after this traumatic event, I started feeling like myself again. I was a survivor. So the challenges I've talked about today that I faced are not unique in the trans community. 51% of transgender women of color have faced homelessness, and 50% of all transgender people has been reported have faced either sexual or physical violence. And it's estimated that up to 80 or 90% of transgender people killed every year by hate crime are transgender women of color. And that has remained constant year after year after year after a decade. I went through a very rough patch for a few years, but finally I found friends who cared about me and a community who cared about me, and I was able to rebuild my life. Regardless of the hardships, the joy of being myself was a source of strength. Being the real me felt like finally being free. So my message today to law enforcement is this. It should not matter what name or gender marker is on an ID, or what the last right-wing politician thinks that they're making public. The law should be there to help all citizens, including transgender people. That's all we ask. Thank you. So, also, I had mentioned law enforcement leaving, but in terms of prosecutors, I would say, and again, this is not just trans people. I'm thinking about, Eliza Fletcher, and I'm thinking about the woman who was raped a year earlier, is to be as vigorous in your prosecution or your investigation or whatever you do, regardless of that person's position, their color. Because before this happened to me, as a trans person, my perception of law enforcement or the whole law enforcement, everyone involved in law enforcement was very positive. I mean, and that was coming from someone who presented as a black man most of my life. You don't hear that in the African American community much, but I had no complaints, personally. But then I went through what I went through, and I was like, okay. And those two things that happened to me, and I don't know in terms of the law, military law, civilian law is a little bit different. If someone's threatening to kill you, I don't know if that's considered free speech. I don't know if they could have been arrested. If I would have stood there, Ruby Tuesday let him punch me a few times, then he could have been arrested, but why wait for that? It wasn't so much that no one got arrested. It was their demeanor, the change, the coldness, the iciness. Well, I felt like they just didn't care about me. So that's just not for law enforcement, because if there is an arrest, then it goes to a different level. And I just want everybody in the community just to treat us the way they would treat anybody, anyone else. There was a movie years ago called A Time to Kill, and it's one of those courtroom movies, and a little black girl, just a movie set down south, a little black girl was raped in the movie. Samuel Jackson was her father, and he killed one of the men who did this. The other two were on trial. No, he killed the men who did this. Samuel Jackson was on trial. And Samuel Jackson talked over the case with his attorney, and he said that you have to pretend that you're on the other side. You have to get into their head, and that's way you can argue the case. And he's a famous actor, but he was arguing the case, and he talked about what these men had done to this little girl, horrific. I won't share that here. You can rent the movie. Then he went through all that, and the last thing he said was, now imagine she was white. And everybody like, whoa. It like blew everybody away, because in their mind, this happened to a little black girl, but imagine she was white. And that won him, this is TV, this is a movie, but that won the case, because they were now able to get to emphasize a whole different level. So no matter where you're at in law enforcement, imagine where's a friend of yours, someone you knew, someone, whatever, and care about us the same way and treat that case the same way you treat any other case that was important to you.